Hey, Shalom, this is Dan, and I'm coming to you again tonight to share a little bit more with you from the Torah. Now, tonight we're going to look at what we finally finished Genesis. We got a lot of good nuggets out of there, at least I know I did. I hope you did as well. But now I want to share with you as we move into Exodus the importance of what we read here in the Torah for Exodus. Now, the first parashah that we come up to in Exodus is called Shemot, and it literally means names. And we know it as Exodus because there's the big exit from Egypt. But if you look at it in Hebrew, the way that they build these parashah portions, or even the books of the Torah, is all based on the first word found in the Torah. Now, if you remember back, Genesis was Bereshit, and Bereshit means beginnings. Again, we have the first word of the Hebrew Bible showing Bereshit bara Eloheinu, and it talks about in the beginning created God, and it lists what He created. Same thing we have here in Exodus. It starts out with the word Shemot, which means names. It starts out, if you read in your Bible there, Exodus 1, it talks about the names of the people who came from the time of Jacob. They came into Egypt, and then they're still there. So we have the names of the people, the names of the tribe of Israel, of all the descendants of Israel. So that's where we get the name from. But as we dig into it, we find that this is now 400 years later from when we left Genesis to here now in Shemot, or Exodus. What happened in that 400 years? Well, the first chapter tells us that obviously the Israelite people, they increased in number. They had more kids. They came in with 70 some at the end of Genesis. And now here we are at the beginning of Exodus, and we have a lot more than just the 70 some that came in. But we also find out that in this transition, the memory of Joseph has been forgotten. Now, again, we got Genesis ending with Joseph being all powerful and hero, the second in command, and Jacob dies, and then shortly thereafter Joseph dies, and there's this whole, people know who Joseph is. We can assume from what we read in Exodus that they kind of kept up with who Joseph was until it says later on that a new Pharaoh stood in power and he did not know who Joseph was. As a result, he decided he wanted to build his kingdom, and who better to help him build his kingdom than the Israelites. Now, that goes back to Genesis as well, that they lost the ability to keep up with the land, to keep up with the wages of the land, and so we read that they kind of gave themselves into the service as their way of payment. But this Pharaoh now takes advantage of that, and he begins to use them as his own personal slaves to build his empire. And here we are now. Israelites have grown so powerful in number that he's afraid they're going to overtake the Egyptians. What does the Pharaoh do? He gets this plan that he's going to go ahead and have babies killed. Well, here's the part that we know. We know that we have Yocheved, who is wanting to hide her son Moses. Now, she's already given birth to Aaron and Miriam, so we know that Aaron is, for the boys at least, we know that Aaron is at least above the age of what Pharaoh said was the cutoff mark. But we have Moses, and he's a baby. He hasn't reached that age yet, so his life is still in danger. Yocheved, his mom, hides him in the basket, it's got the tar and the pitch and all that around it, and puts him in the water. Now here, I want to give you this little tidbit, because you might not know this. I just found this out not too long ago myself. The Hebrew word for ark, if you remember Noah in Genesis chapter 6, the Hebrew word for ark is the same word used here for Moses in the basket. And it's really the same thing. Noah had his ark that he built with wood and pitch, tar. You got Moses the same way. He's in a basket with the tar and the pitch around it. It's the same thing. Noah on the grand scale is the big basket of animals and 8 people who were brought safely while the flood was going on. And here you are later on with with Moses now in the same situation. He's being carefully placed into his place in the Torah. Now, with all that being said, the basket lands on the doorstep of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter takes him in. Miriam, watching all this, comes up to her and says, "Would you like me to go fetch a Hebrew mother so that she can do the nursing?" Sure enough, Pharaoh's daughter says, that'll be great. Miriam brings Yocheved, again, Moses' real mom, and she is able to be reunited with her son in the aspects of nurturing him and feeding him and all that type of stuff. But it moves on, and we jump from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and it's about a 40-year span in between chapter 1 and chapter 2, to where we have Moses as a man. Moses, as a man, was powerful again. I mean, he's being raised in the family of Pharaoh. But I want to bring your attention to something. Now, I love the movie The Prince of Egypt. But at the beginning of the movie, it says in the little caption, and when the screen's all black and there's some words there, and it says that this is our understanding or our belief of what happened in the book of Exodus. Some of the things in the movie, as I was reading through the Torah, are not what really happened in the Torah. I'm going to give you an example. We know that based on chapter 2 here, we know that Moses killed a guard. And we know that when Moses saw the two Israelites fighting, that one of them called out and said, "Hey, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian guy?" In the movie, it's a little different because it shows that there was this accidental push and the guy falls down and Moses is running and running and running, and he's being followed by Ramses, his brother, and he says, "Oh, I'll make it as though it never happened. I am the sun and the stars," and all that type of stuff. So I'll make it as though it never happened. But look with me in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15. Now, it says, "When Pharaoh heard of it, he tried to have Moses put to death. But Moses fled from Pharaoh to live in the land of Midian." A little bit different than what we see in the movie. Here in the Bible, we see that Moses is actually, his life is wanted because of what he did by killing the Egyptians, by killing the Egyptian person. Whereas in the movie, Moses' own guilt is what makes him run away. So I bring that up to you because I want us to not necessarily go with what we see Charlton Heston acting out or what we see in The Prince of Egypt, but I want to bring you to the Torah itself. There's an old song by Whiteheart that says, "Read the book, don't wait for the movie." It's actually kind of funny, but kind of true, because in the movie, and this way with almost every movie, when you read the book, you get so much more out of it, and when you watch the movie, there's either parts missing or parts that were added to it that were never part of what really happened. So I want to encourage you, before I go any farther, to read the book. Read the book of Exodus, and you'll see these things. You'll see that there are some leniencies that the companies take when they make these movies. But more important than that, when we're reading God's Word, that's how we get fed. That's how we get strong. Now, with all that said, I want to take you to chapters 3 and 4. And I'm going to kind of sum it up, but here's about how it looks. Moses is standing before the burning bush. Now, he saw this blaze out in the distance, and it was a bush, but it looked like it was on fire, but it wasn't really burning. And so he went up to this bush or this tree, whatever it might have been, and he says, and the Bible says that a voice called out and said, "Moses, take off your shoes, for where you're standing is holy ground." And Moses takes off his shoes. Now, remember this, Moses is in a desert. There are certain things you don't do when you're in the desert. Taking off your shoes might be one of them, because the sand is hot. Now, we don't know if this tree was tucked away in some cave or in the shade part or what, but normally in the desert, the sand would be hot. That's why they wear shoes. But here we see we see God calling from the bush, "Moses, take off your shoes, for where you're standing is holy ground." Now it goes on, and Moses has this conversation with God, and God's basically saying, "I'm calling you out, Moses. I've heard the distress of my people. I've heard them calling out, and they need a deliverer, and I'm sending you." Now Moses might not have been the most qualified person in the world, but in that moment God said, "I don't care what anyone else says. I choose you because you are qualified, because I am on your side." We see this in all the scriptures. God doesn't call the people who are the greatest, but he makes the people who are willing to be used the greatest. and he can do that for you as well. So here we are with Moses, and he has this burning bush speaking to him. And one of the things he does is the bush says to lay down your staff. And Moses lays down his staff when God is proving to him who he is and the wonders that he can do. And he puts down his staff, and it turns into a snake. And now, I will be honest, I do not like snakes. I was mowing the grass one time back in another house I lived in, and we had 3 acres. I'm push mowing this thing, and I moved a little piece of wood, and sure enough, there was a snake. And I don't mind telling you that I ran home screaming like a little girl. And I came back out ready to face this thing, and I had the lawnmower and an axe and a shovel and a hoe and a weed whacker and anything I was going to need to get this thing killed. And it never came back. So I mowed the grass the rest of that day looking like this, because I was not going to get attacked by this thing. But anyway, Moses, his staff turns into a snake. And then God says, pick it up by its tail. Now, I won't pick a snake up, period. But I sure as heck ain't going to pick one up by its tail, knowing that it might come back and get me. But yet Moses trusted God, and he picked it up by its tail, and it came back into a staff. And one of the other things that God did is he said, put your hand in your pocket. Now, all these things, God is trying to prove himself to Moses, because Moses keeps making excuses. I can't go because of this. I can't go because of that. What if they don't listen to me? What if this happens? And God's debunking every one of his theories and thoughts and fears. And so he says, stick your hand in your robe. And he sticks his hand in his robe, and it pulls it out, and it's white with leprosy. And God says, put your hand back in your robe. And he puts it back in, and he pulls it out, and it's been fully restored. God is so awesome. He's showing Moses that these are the things that he's going to use to prove who he is, not only to Moses, but to the people who he's going to deliver, and the people who he's going to deliver his people from. And then Moses keeps on going. I stutter. God says, I am your voice. And Moses says, well, who am I going to tell him is sending me? Now, God's answer is, I am that I am. That's how it's related to us in the Bible. But think about this. The Egyptians had so many gods, and we'll talk about this as we go through the plagues. They had so many gods that what was another god? In fact, we even know later on that when Pharaoh meets up with Moses again, he says, what god should I obey to let these people go? Well, that sounds like a dumb question to us because we know the power of God. But again, think about the culture back then. The Egyptians served so many gods. They had the god of the sun, the god of the water, the god of the moon, the god of the harvest, all these things. We know him as one God. The Shema says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's Deuteronomy 6:4. But the Egyptians didn't know him that way. A lot of cultures today still don't know him that way. That's what the whole Bible bunks up against. All the gods of Baal. Baal was just anything that wasn't God. People serving trees and rocks and all this type stuff. But God was one. And so God says, you tell Pharaoh, I am that I am is sending you. That's the God he should listen to. I want to tell you something as we close out here. The Torah portion goes on, and we see how God provides for Moses, Aaron, his brother, to help him with his speech. And we see that Moses gets ready for his confrontation with Pharaoh. But let me leave you with this. God has called you. God has called you for a mission and for a purpose. And you might know what it is and you might not. And you might know what it is and you might be afraid of it. And maybe you're sitting there thinking of all these excuses. God, I stutter. God, I don't do good in crowds. I have a fear of public speaking. God, I'm too short. God, my hair's not the right color. God, I'm too white. God, I'm all these things. But let me tell you something. If God, it ain't like God didn't know all this. And it ain't like God can't use all this. I heard when I was in college that God does not call the equipped, but he equips the called. You are called. You're called for a reason. You're called with purpose. And all these excuses you're giving God, well, They're just like armpits. Everyone has them, and they all stink. Listen to what God is saying to you. Listen to what He's telling you, and know that He's not going to give you a mission that you can't accomplish without His help anyway. He wants you to lean on Him. He wants you to come to Him. Seek Him. How are you supposed to move from point A to point B? Seek Him. He'll tell you how to get there. God has called you for something. The burning bush, it was a wake-up call for Moses. It was his personal cell phone call. Moses, I got a job for you. I need you to get these Israelites out of Egypt. Maybe I'm your phone call. Maybe you're watching this and you needed someone like me to say, hey, you got a mission. Don't give up on it. God's right there with you. I've been there myself. I got a mission that I'm supposed to do. And it took someone calling me to say, hey, let's get this done. It took God calling me up and say, hey, are you going to do what I asked you to do? I gave all the excuses. And here I am. I'm doing what He called me to do. I'm trusting that every other step that He's asked me to do is going to happen in due time. I'm Dan. Shalom.